In terms of metrics as well, when you are setting up your metadata level, occasionally there can be confusion around metrics, because in a metric, when you drop it into a report, you do have the option of applying aggregations to those. So things like sums, averages, counts, maximums, minimums. But you can also have those metrics unaggregated, so it's looking at more of a row-based representation. So what you can occasionally see is a bit of confusion around how a metric is set up and the interactions, how it's interacting with those other dimensions that are dropped into the report that it's grouping by. So what we often find is we try to make sure everything is aggregated by default to the kind of aggregation that you're looking for. So maybe I have my age, which I always want an average, but I've got my invoicing, but that I always want as a sum. And this avoids confusion, because when you drop this in, instantly it's using those fields and dimensions you've got in there and aggregating by those. And if you do need to do a row by row representation, you could always just remove the aggregation at the report level. So as I mentioned here, this is quite flexible. It's setting a default. It's not hard coding it in, so the user does have the ability to make changes to that based on personal need. So if we're looking at how we would set up something like these default aggregations, when you're in your metadata level at the second step, what you can do then is for each of these metrics you see, the blue circles, you can double click on those, go to your formatting menu, and you can define a default aggregation. And this will hold for any report you create with these fields from now on. You can also, when you're setting up things like custom calculations or fields or metrics, you can also bring those aggregations into it as well. So instead of having this particular invoice difference field as amount minus estimate, there could be confusion when that's dropped into the report. Is it or is it not aggregated? Whereas if you drop those aggregations in here, this instantly works for any field that has dimensions where you're grouping by. So it's instantly using those group bys to make sure you're getting the right figures. And again, you would probably want to make sure that in your description you're displaying exactly the logic that is going on within this particular metric, just so it's easily understandable if someone needs to reference that. Another thing we do recommend when you are working with your metadata level or your views is to have a look at the editing methods that you can use. So when you are editing a view, you'll be sent to a page that looks a little bit like this. So what you'll see is instantly you'll be able to edit as either a clone or edit directly the existing view. So there's a couple of pros and cons for each of those, and this will depend on what kind of access you need to the view while you're editing it. We often do recommend that users use the clone method for editing the report, because that does mean there's no interruption to any report access or report creation from that view. Because what does happen there is it creates a copy or a clone that you can then edit. When you're happy with that and you save it and activate it, it then overwrites the original. So there's no break in access to the reports. It's all done while people are still reviewing their content. This also does give you the ability to roll back any changes you've made. So once you've saved that, you see that, okay, this metric was not quite right, or this change didn't work, you can go to the view and say, roll this back to the original version. If you were using something like the edit existing, this might be a case where there's not huge amounts of people having to access that data source, and when you do edit existing, it takes that view or that metadata level into draft mode and lets you edit the existing, and then once you save or activate that, the access is then restored. Another thing we do like to bring into the metadata level is actually making sure we have the right underlying data setup. So often when we're looking at consulting or database management, we look at the structure of the data, but one thing we look at in particular in relation to our views and our metadata level is the indexing or the structuring of the fields there. We always do recommend that the fields are set up as well as possible. So the use of things like indexes, so single, unique, or composite indexes that you can apply to fields within your database can have a great effect on the speed of Yellowfin content. So what you can do there is you can set those indexes on fields that are commonly used. So that might be something like joins between tables in your schema, or even fields that are used often as filters, because that reference to those fields, they'll be looked up a whole lot more quickly within the queries if you're actually setting those up as indexes. So really making sure that any fields you're joining or any fields that you're going to be filtering a lot on, you want to make sure that they've been indexed within your database environment for the best performance there. And obviously this does help you from the performance side of things if you're looking at larger or more complex schemas with ranges, larger numbers of tables brought into it, because obviously with Yellowfin, when it does run a report, it's going to do all those it's going to bring in all those joins that it needs between tables there. So it could be bringing in 3 or 4 different joins. So you want to make sure those are definitely indexed and gives you enough power to run those queries with good performance. We also do, often when we're setting up the metadata level, try to keep things very targeted, very specific, and as we say here, we really only take what you need. So really making sure that you're only including the fields, the metrics, the custom content that's relevant to the data needs. So really making sure that you're not just throwing everything in, you're not putting every single column or metric that you have in your database into the view. You want to balance this based on what you need for your requirements for your reporting. So if you know you have a set of 10 reports that require 3 metrics and 6 dimensions, then you would add those in. You wouldn't add in the other 20 dimensions that may never be used, because that can just cause a bit of noise and confusion, and they might be used accidentally. Whereas if you don't make those available in the metadata layer, then they won't ever be there to confuse the user or be misused any particular way. And this flows across to how you can balance your view setup. So how you're balancing larger general views with a lot of tables against more smaller targeted views. So an example is you might have, again, 10 reports that use a particular set of data, particular set of tables. So you could create one view or one metadata level that addresses that. Whereas you might have, in another case, 2 sets of 5 reports, and both of those 2 sets of reports, they have their own sets of metrics. So maybe it's worth breaking that view into 2 and having more targeted, so you're not having a report based on a view where only half of the fields might be used. And this is really just making sure you make the data relevant, and that's by including only what you need in terms of your fields and metrics, so you've got the most useful and most effective way of creating reports.